Hello everyone, welcome to the second video for chapter 18, and we're going to be talking in this one on how the revolution unfolds, right? The next phases in the French Revolution. Now, depending on what social class you belong to, the opening events of the revolution, with the tennis court oath and the storming of the Bastille, they could have been met with either tremendous excitement or fear. A lot of the time it was a mix of both. The fear among the upper class was that the Third Estate would rise up and kill them. But there was fear among all classes, hence the name of the early period in the Revolution known as the Great Fear. Now, the Great Fear was set off by a horrible famine. Bad harvests led to starving peasants. Here you see a picture of peasants going in and having to basically sell anything that they have for food because they were starving out in the countryside. And when people are starving, they tend to get upset. They were also very paranoid that the nobles would try to impress them and kill any changes that were brought about by the early stages of the revolution. This, in turn, led to widespread peasant uprisings. They destroyed noble homes. They scared the heck out of the upper classes. It really got very, very ugly. Now, these problems weren't just in the countryside. There was chaos in the streets of Paris as groups fought for control. Eventually, the National Assembly. Now remember, that was the group started by the Third Estate, and when it broke away from the Estates General, and eventually members of the First and Second Estate realized that they had to join as well. So eventually the National Assembly decides that they got to do something to kind of, tone down the craziness that's spreading throughout France. And one of the first things that the Assembly did was it ended the old special privileges. Now remember, here you've got your three estates. You got the first, you got the second, and you got the third. The first and second had all sorts of privilege. Remember that bar graph we had from the previous video showing how there was unequal land distribution, there was disproportionate land distribution, I should say, there was way disproportionate shouldering of the taxes. And so they decided, let's end this. The nobles in the church, they had it really, really good under the Ancien regime, under the old order. And the peasants were getting screwed. Now, they said, all right, the first and second are going to pay more taxes and they're going to give up some of their old privileges. Now, these changes weren't actually that huge, but they did set the stage for more radical reforms, such as the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Now, as you can tell, this document was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, but it also took things from the English Bill of Rights and including the American Bill of Rights, although they were kind of being made around the same time. Excuse me. And this was based on Enlightenment principles, just like the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and so forth. It said that all men are born with natural rights like life, liberty, property, security, etc. It also said that all men were equal before the law. All right, so equality before the law, that's a big change for French society. And its principles were in the revolutionary slogan, liberty, equality, fraternity. Here you see this slogan here. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, right? United, indivisible, of the Republic, right? Until death, mort, death, right? So fighting to the death to uphold these three principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? Liberty, freedom, equality, just what sounds, and fraternity, brotherhood, right? All Frenchmen together. The Declaration sounded nice, but if you look at the title, it leaves out a large group of the French population, namely women. Women were disappointed that the Declaration only pertained to men. There was nothing in there. It said all men are equal before the law. Nothing about women. So aside from the wording of its title, the Declaration gave no new rights or status to women. One woman in particular took it upon herself to implement change, and her name was Olympe de Gouges, kind of a funky name to say. You get the quote from her: "Woman is born free and lives equal to man in her rights. Social distinctions can be based only on the common utility." That is a direct kind of appropriation of a phrase from the Declaration of the Rights of Man, but free and lives equal to man in her rights. That was a very radical notion for the late 1700s. She wrote this in the Declaration of the Rights of Women and Female Citizens. Okay, so as you can see, this was a direct response to the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Now, this was met with some support at first, but de Gouges and other more outspoken women were eventually dealt with harshly during later stages of the revolution. Another event during the Revolution that women played a very important role in was this thing called the March on Versailles. Now, many in Paris were starving, and in October of 1789, about 6,000 women gathered in the streets of Paris, and they marched the 13 miles from Paris to the King's Palace in Versailles, and they were chanting bread as they marched and when they reached there, and once they got there, they demanded the king come out and return with them to Paris. Now, realizing that he had no choice, the king and his family, they returned with the crowd. And so it was basically like a victorious army that these women stormed off and, kind of dragged the king and his family. Not literally, but, still, he realized that he didn't want a huge riot of thousands of women on his hands. It weakened the status of the king even further in the eyes of both the government and the people, though. And plus, they didn't know it at the time, but the royal family would never again return to Versailles. All right, now some more reforms. These were made by the National Assembly. France was still in huge debt, from these wars and so forth, and they needed to raise money. And a drastic step that the National Assembly took to do this was the Civil Constitution of the Clergy in 1790. Essentially, this put the church under government control. Right? It made priests and bishops employees of the French government, and all church land and property was now belonging to France. Hence, in this political cartoon, they're confiscating everything from it. And then the French government could then sell it off in order to raise money to decrease the debt. It also ended the authority of the Pope over French Catholics. Now, as you can imagine, this was not meant with universal acceptance. Priests and bishops hated it. The Pope excommunicated the entire country. And it was also rejected by rural peasants who tend to be more religiously conservative. And this created some problems between the revolutionaries in Paris and the peasants in the countryside. Another big change was here you have a depiction. This was something that kind of depicted how the peasants viewed France's new treatment of the church. Here you've got the Pope being burnt at the stake. Now that didn't actually happen, obviously, but it meant to symbolize just the horrible treatment of the Catholic Church by the new French government. But another set of reforms were implemented with the Constitution of 1791. This created a limited monarchy. All right, so you see the picture here of the king in a cage. Now, this wasn't literal, but it was, accurate in terms of the extent of Louis's power. Louis was basically under house arrest after he was brought back to Paris. He tried to escape and he was caught. So they said, you're never allowed to leave again. He really had most of his power taken from him. That power would in turn go to the legislative branch. It gave the Legislative Assembly the power to create taxes. They could declare war. They could make laws. Obviously, that's what the legislative branch does. But it really weakened the power of the king. For many, the Constitution completed the revolution, right? That's what they wanted, a new Constitution and a new system of government. But for many others, it didn't go far enough. And this eventually led to more radicals gaining power in government. Now, as we just said, for a lot of people, the Civil Constitution of the Clergy and the Constitution of 1791 didn't go far enough, right? It wasn't enough. They wanted more change. And a number of events allowed these more radical groups to come to power. A major problem France faced at this point was conflict with other nations. These conflicts began because Europe began to turn on France. And here's a map of Europe in 1789. So you notice France here, the Bourbon family, Louis XVI, right? That's the king of France. His wife, Marie Antoinette, was a member of the Habsburg family, right? Which was a royal family of Austria. So, with them under house arrest, Austria obviously is not going to be a particularly big fan of what's going on in France. England is still a monarchy. Spain is still a monarchy. Prussia was a powerful up-and-coming country, which was also a monarchy. They're nervous about what's going on in here. Monarchs feared that the revolution would spread. They didn't want the ideas of the revolution spreading into their lands. These ideas were stoked by émigrés. Émigrés were nobles and priests who fled France when they began to lose their status. These émigrés, they spread horror stories of what was going on. It's a little bit blurry, but you can kind of make out you've got nobles and kings and so forth. They're running for their lives. And you've got the rats, and you can kind of make out these hats. These were the revolutionary hats that they wore in France. And the fire in the background, the guillotine, we'll talk about that, how that became the big symbol of the revolution. But there's chaos. There's these horrible, monstrous rats that are fleeing. And, these monarchs kind of took it upon themselves that they had to do something to stop this. They closed the borders and began speaking out against the new French government. And many in France feared that war was going to come. And so due to the unease and fear, many lost faith in the new French government, in the National Assembly, and this led to radicals taking more power, such as the sans-culottes, right? The sans-culottes were working class groups. Let me move me out of the way so you can firmly see this dude. Culottes were the fancy knee breeches that the nobles and the upper class wore. Well, these guys were working class, so you're not going to wear that stuff. So sans here means without, right? And culottes were the fancy. So they wore long trousers for the working men, working in the fields and in the factories and so forth. And they represented a rejection of the upper class among the working class in the Third Estate. And they began calling for a republic. Now, the problem with that is that you can't have a monarchy and a republic. So for a republic to happen, the king would have to go. Now, the sans-culottes were growing in influence, but they were mostly uneducated of the lower class. They gained leadership, though, from the Jacobins. The Jacobins were a revolutionary group of bourgeoisie, of middle class. Let me erase this. There we go. And they pushed for a more radical agenda, calling for more extreme change. They also eventually gained support in the government, eventually winning control of the legislative branch in 1792. France, now controlled by the radicals, decided not to wait for the rest of Europe to attack and declared war. Right, so they declared war on England, Austria, and Prussia. Right, France now had to deal with both internal and external conflicts, so it was going to be a long uphill battle for them. So that talks about kind of the transition from the opening stages into the later one, and in the next video we will really get into the radical phase and all the crazy stuff that happened during that period.